I had ridden 900 miles of burned country to forget one face, and I found it again on a Tuesday in a fish market at the edge of the known world. It was the fall of the light that did it, the low river sun catching the curve of a cheek as a woman turned to weigh a basket of silver eels, and my whole body went still the way the forest goes still before the snow comes. I did not breathe. I had spent 6 years learning to be a man who could survive her absence, and in the space of one heartbeat, I was ruined all over again. She was gone before I could cross the square. The crowd of Faramir closed over her like water over a dropped stone, and I stood among the reeking barrels with my hood down and my hands shaking like a green boy's. It could not be her. I knew it could not be her because I had knelt in the ashes of Kelvhalo with my brother's men around me, and I had felt the mate bond go out inside my chest like a candle pinched between two fingers. A man does not mistake that. When your fated one dies, you feel the thread that ties soul to soul simply cease to be, and for 6 years I had lived with a frayed and blackened end where a whole living rope had once been. I had grieved. I had raged. I had crossed the sea and come back and let them think me dead in turn, because the man who was Alpha King of the Iron Moon had died in that valley too, and only this hollow wanderer had walked out. And yet the light on her cheek had struck the frayed end of that rope like a bell. I told myself it was the road. I had been 3 months in the saddle, sleeping in ditches and old shrines, living on hard bread and colder purpose, and a starved man sees the faces he loves in every window. I bought a skewer of grilled fish I did not want and ate it standing, and I watched the place where she had vanished until the sun slid behind the tannery roofs and the lamplighters came out with their long poles. She did not come back. Of course she did not. The dead are not in the habit of coming back, and I of all men should have known it, for I had built a life out of not coming back. Let me tell you where I was so you understand the shape of the ruin. My name is Rhyston Vale. Before the war I was Alpha King over the whole gray stretch of the Iron Moon Reach, from the pine seat at Heirs down to the salt marshes, and my word turned the moot, and my hand held the wolf seat that my father's fathers had held for 11 generations. We are lichen folk, the old blood men and women who wear a second shape under the moon and carry the ancestor-wolves in our marrow, and I was the strongest of us, which in our world means only that more people wanted me dead than wanted anyone else dead. When the Blight War came up out of the south, I rode to meet it as a king must, and I left behind at Heirs a wife who was more than a wife. A Sen, my fated mate. The one the moon had made for me and me alone, marked at the throat with the same dark crescent I carried, so that even the elders wept the day the bond first sang between us, because such a matching comes maybe once in 100 years. I lost her in the second winter. Word came that Kelvhalo had fallen while I was pinned at the fords 100 leagues east, that the town where I had sent her for safety had burned to its foundations, that no one within its walls had lived. I felt the bond die that same night, I have told you, and something in me that had been a king simply lay down and would not get up. I fought the rest of that war like a man walking into the sea. When it ended, I did not go home. I could not. I let the survivors carry back the tale that Rhyston Vale had fallen at the ash fords, and I took ship south and spent 5 years being no one in particular, a sellsword, a caravan guard, a shape that moved through other people's countries. It was easier to be dead than to sit on a throne beside an empty chair. What brought me north again was not hope. It was a rumor, carried by a peddler in a border town, that my cousin Vorin Ashgard sat the wolf seat now and called himself King of the Iron Moon, and that under his hand the Reach had gone rotten and cruel. That woke the old thing in me, not love, I thought, but the plain animal refusal to let Vorin of all men wear my father's iron. So I had come back to look at my ruined country with my own eyes before I decided whether to die in it. Faramir was the last free river town, 3 days' hard ride from Heirs, a place too poor and too stubborn for Vorin to bother crushing, and I had meant only to pass through it. Instead I stood in its fish market until full dark, aching over a woman who could not be my wife. And when at last I turned to find a bed, I nearly trod on a child's toy lying in the mud between 2 stalls. I bent and picked it up without thinking, the way a soldier picks up a fallen thing. It was a little carved wolf, no longer than my thumb, worn, pale, and smooth with handling, and my hands knew it before my eyes did. I know how I cut a wolf. I know the flat plane I leave along the flank because my knife runs that way, the way I notch 3 lines at the shoulder for the ancestor marks, the deep gouge of the eye that my father taught me and his father taught him. I had carved 1,000 of them in my life. For my own children I never got to have, for the pups of my pack, for a sen on the night I asked the moon for her. This wolf had been cut by a hand that carved exactly as I carve. I stood in the dark with the little thing burning in my palm, and for the first time in 6 years I let myself be afraid of hope. I did not sleep. I sat in the common room of a river inn called the Drowned Otter with the carved wolf on the table in front of me and a cup of sour beer going flat at my elbow, and I turned the thing over and over while the last drinkers stumbled out into the night. A carving is not proof. Any journeyman who had ever watched a veil cut wood could copy the style. I told myself that 100 times. But the bond end in my chest had not gone quiet again since the market. It ached the way an old wound aches before rain, a deep animal warning that something long buried was moving under the ground. I had felt nothing there in 6 years. Now it would not be still. Toward the gray hour before dawn, the innkeeper, a broad, tired woman named Halla who ran the otter with her sons, came to bank the fire and found me still sitting. She looked at the carving, and she looked at my face, and something in her softened and sharpened at the same time. "That's the little Mar boys," she said. "Corin's, he's forever losing them. His mother carves them for him and his sister by the dozen, and still they lose them faster than she can cut." She held out her hand for it, meaning to keep it behind the bar for the child. I did not give it to her. I could not have opened my fingers if the roof had come down. "Mar," I said, and my voice came out wrong. "The mother, what is she called?" Halla frowned at the strangeness of me. "Asen," she said, "Widow Mar. Come up the river 6 years back with nothing but the clothes on her and a belly out to here, and made herself a living sewing and healing. Keeps to herself. Good woman. Why does a road-worn stranger want to know the name of a seamstress?" I heard the name the way you hear the crack of ice under your own feet, one instant of pure clean terror before the fall. "Asen, 6 years back, a belly out to here." "Where," I said, "where does she live?" Halla stepped back from the table then, because whatever was in my face was not the face of an ordinary man asking an ordinary question, and some old instinct told her she was standing very close to something with teeth. "Now you listen," she began, low and hard, planting herself between me and the door like a mother wolf. "I don't know what you are, but that woman has had trouble enough in her life without." "I would sooner cut off my own hand," I said, "than bring her harm. On my blood I swear it. Halla, please." Maybe it was the please. Kings do not say please, and I had said it like a man drowning. She looked at me a long moment, and then she looked at the little wolf, and then, "God help us both," she told me. 2 streets up from the water, the last cottage under the willow, the one with the herb garden and the blue door. I was on my feet with the carving closed in my fist. Dawn was breaking gray and cold over the river, and the market carts were already rumbling out toward the square. And somewhere 2 streets up under a willow tree there was a blue door. And behind it, if the world had any mercy left in it at all, there was the wife I had buried 6 years ago and mourned across 2 seas. I did not go. That is the part I cannot explain even now, except to say that a man who has learned to survive without hope becomes afraid of it the way a starved man is afraid of a full table, that his ruined body will not bear the sudden richness of it. I stood in the road with the sun coming up, and I could not make my feet carry me to that door, because if I knocked and it was not her, I would finally, truly die. So I stood, and the light grew, and the blue door under the willow stayed shut, and I understood that I was more of a coward now than I had ever been on any battlefield of my life. Then the blue door opened, and a small boy ran out into the garden calling for a wolf he had lost. He was perhaps 6 years old, dark-haired, quick as water, and at the hollow of his throat, above the collar of his little rough tunic, the rising sun caught a mark I would have known in my grave, a dark crescent cradling a single star. The mark of the veil, my father's mark, the mark that no living soul on this earth carried but me. And behind him in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron, stood a woman who had been dead for 6 years, looking straight across the garden at me. The bond did not sing. That is not the word. It was a wound reopening and closing in the same breath, 6 years of scar tissue tearing wide, and in the same instant the torn edges knitting whole, so that in one heartbeat I felt both the whole agony of losing her and the whole impossible mending of having her back. And I made a sound I have never made before or since, and my knees went into the cold mud of the road. Asen's hands stopped on the apron. Her face went white as milk, and her mouth shaped a word without any sound behind it at all, the name of a dead king, the name of a ghost. "Riston," she said. I do not remember crossing the garden. I remember kneeling in the mud, And I remember that the next thing in the world was her hands on my face, cold and rough and trembling and alive, turning my head up to the light as if she too could not believe her eyes had not lied. 6 years. Her thumbs found the old scar above my brow, the one she used to trace on winter nights, and when she felt that it was real, her whole body folded down against mine, and we knelt together in the wet garden holding on to one another like two people who had each fallen through the ice and found, impossibly, the other's hand under the black water. "They told me you burned," I said into her hair. "Kelvhalo, they told me no one lived. I felt you die, Asen. I felt the bond go out." "They told me the same of you." Her voice broke on it. "Riston, they carried your banner back with a dead man under it. They swore before the moot that the king fell at the Ashfords. I mourned you for 6 years. I named our son for your father because I thought you would never." She stopped. She pulled back from me, and I watched a new understanding come into her face, and with it a new fear, sharper than grief. She looked past my shoulder at the small, dark-haired boy who stood frozen at the edge of the garden staring at the strange man weeping in the mud with his mother. And she said very quietly, "Our son." The boy's name was Corin, and he was not alone. Because while I still knelt there with the whole earth pitching under me, the blue door opened a second time, and a small girl came out to see what her brother was shouting about, dark-haired like him, like me, with her mother's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and at the hollow of her throat the same dark crescent and single star. Twins. A boy and a girl, 6 years old, born in a river town in the summer after their father died at a battle he had in truth survived. Corin for my father. And the girl, Asen told me later, she had named Wren, because in the worst of that first winter, a wren had nested in the eaves above the cradle and sung all through the cold, and she had decided to take it as a sign that something small could live through anything. I want to tell you that I rose and gathered my children into my arms and that the world was made whole. It was not so simple, and I will not pretend it was because they did not know me. To Corin and Wren, I was a filthy, weeping stranger from the road, and they did what sensible pups do before a strange, large male. They backed toward their mother and watched me with wide, wary eyes. And that more than the burned country, more than the stolen throne, more than any of it, that was the blade that went the deepest. 6 years of their lives. First words, first steps, the fevers and the night frights and the small daily triumphs of 2 whole human souls coming into being. And I had been on the far side of the sea being no one, mourning the very people who were, all that while, alive and needing a father who did not come. Asen saw it in my face. She has always seen everything in my face. She got to her feet and drew the children in against her skirts, one hand on each dark head, and she looked at me with 6 years of hard living in her eyes and said the truest thing anyone said to me that whole day. "You could not have known," she said. "Neither of us could have known. Grieve later, Riston. Come inside before the whole street sees the king of the Iron Moon kneeling in my cabbages." She knew. Of course she knew what I was. She had been my queen. But the way she said it, low and quick with a flick of her eyes toward the road, told me something else, something that put the soldier back into my spine and drove the grief down where it would keep. She was afraid to have my name spoken aloud in Fairomere. She had raised 2 children with the veil mark on their throats in a town 3 days from the wolf's seat, and she had done it in hiding under a false widow's name, and she was afraid. Inside the cottage, with the blue door shut and barred and the shutters drawn, over a fire and a pot of thin barley broth, she told me why. Voron knew the children existed. Not that they lived, he believed, as all the Reach believed, that Asen Vale had died at Kelvhalo with the king's line inside her. But he knew that she had been carrying when the war took me, and Voron Ashgard is not a man who leaves a loose thread when he can burn it. In the first year of his regency, before he ever dared put the crown on his own head, his riders had gone through every town within 100 leagues of the ashes of Kelvhalo, and they had done a quiet and thorough murder of every child of the right age who bore any mark upon the throat. Asen had heard of it in time. A midwife 2 villages over had sent word up the river ahead of the riders. Mothers protect mothers, in the bad years. And Asen had taken her infant twins and walked into the marshes and lain in the cold reeds for 2 days while Voron's men rode the roads. And after that she had gone north to Fairomere and become the widow Mar, and she had cut the necks of her children's tunics high, and she had carved them little wolves to keep them quiet and taught them never. Never to let a stranger see the marks at their throats. He cannot rule while a true-blooded heir of the line still breathes, she said. The moot will crown a strong region in a hard time. They will even swallow a usurper if he keeps the peace. But the ancestor-wolves will not answer false blood, and every wolf of the Iron Moon knows it. Voren has held the seat 6 years, and the pale host has never once come to his calling. The pack tolerates him because they believe the true line is dead, and a living tyrant is better than a war of succession. If it were known that your children lived, that the marked heirs of Risten Vale were alive. She looked at the 2 dark heads bent over their broth, and her hand tightened on the table. He would not stop until they were in the ground. And now their father, the dead king, has come walking up my garden path in broad daylight, and half the market saw a hooded stranger asking after the widow Mar not 2 hours ago. I understood then what I had done. I had come looking for a ghost, and I had thrown a stone into still water, and the rings of it were already spreading. A stranger in the drowned otter asking a mother's name. A king kneeling in the cabbages. In a town this small, by nightfall it would be a story, and stories run downriver, and 3 days downriver sat a man who had built his whole stolen reign on the certainty that these 2 children were bones in the marsh. "Then we don't have long," I said. "We," Asen repeated, and there was something in the word, not warmth, not yet. We were too broken and too new for warmth, but a testing of the weight of it, as if she were lifting a beam to see whether it would bear. She had carried these children alone for 6 years. She had made every choice alone, had lain awake alone, had stood between her babies and the dark alone, and here was the man who was supposed to have stood there with her, come back from the dead full of we, as though 6 years could be stepped over like a puddle. I did not blame her for the way she said it. I have never once blamed her for anything in her whole brave life. "We," I said again, and I meant it with everything I had left. "I did not know, Asen, but I know now. And I will not walk out of that door and leave the 3 of you to Voren Ashgard's riders. Whatever else I have become, and I have become very little that I am proud of, I am still what the moon made me. I am their father. I am your mate. Let me be that. Tell me only what you need, and I will spend the last of myself to give it to you." She was quiet a long time. The fire ticked. Corin, bolder now, had crept close enough to study the hilt of my knife where it showed at my belt, and I felt the small warmth of him against my knee like a coal against frozen skin. And Asen looked at me across the table, across 6 years and 2 graves that had turned out to be empty, and I watched her decide to trust me, not all at once, not with everything, but a little, a first thin thread thrown back across the gap. "What I need," she said, "is to get my children out of this town alive, before the story reaches the water." I opened my mouth to answer her, and someone knocked hard and slow and 3 times on the blue door. Corin went still against my knee. Ren looked up from her broth, and Asen's face, which had begun in the last hour to remember how to be soft, closed over like the marsh closing over a sinking man. She rose without a sound, gathered both children behind her, and looked to me, not for rescue, I saw, but the way one soldier looks to another, measuring. I put my hand on my knife and moved to the wall beside the door where a man standing could not be seen through the shutter crack, and I felt the wolf come up under my skin for the first time in 6 years, the old killing calm, and I was almost grateful for it. The knock came again, 3 slow blows, and a voice on the other side of the blue door, oiled and pleasant and entirely without mercy, said, "Open in the name of the King of the Ironmoon. We're told a stranger came asking after this house. His grace does so like to know who's been visiting his loyal river folk." Asen moved before I did. She swept both children up the ladder to the sleeping loft with 2 low words I did not hear and a look that put them there as surely as a hand. And then she came back down and took an apron off its hook and tied it on and became, in the space of 3 breaths, the widow Mar again, tired, harmless, a little cross at being woken. Only her eyes, when they cut to me, were not harmless at all. She flicked them toward the back of the cottage, toward a low door I had not marked, and I understood. There was a way out through the garden and over the wall. She was telling me to go. She would stand at her own door and lie to a king's riders with her children in the loft above her head, and she wanted me gone before my face and did every lie she had lived for 6 years. I did not go. I put my back to the wall by the door and shook my head once, and I saw her jaw tighten, and then she stopped arguing with me because there was no time, and she lifted the bar and opened the blue door on its chain. There were 2 of them on the step, and a 3rd in the road holding the horses. I could see them through the shutter crack, Voren's marsh riders in the gray and black of the false king, with the running wolf badge that my cousin had stolen off my own house and turned into a brand. The one who had spoken was lean and smiling, a hunter's smile, the smile of a man who enjoyed the work. He leaned into the gap of the door as if the 2 of them were old friends. "Widow Mar," he said, reading it off some list in his head. Seamstress. All alone up here with your little ones more's the pity in these hard times. We're told a stranger was asking your name in the market yesterday. Big man, hooded, foreign-looking, came in off the south road. His smile widened. The king's peace being what it is, his grace takes an interest in foreign men who ask after lone women. Did such a man come to your door, mother? Half the market asks my name, Asen said, flat and weary. I sew for half the market. If some hooded southerner wants a shirt mended, he can knock like anyone else, and I'll charge him double for the trouble of it. And no, he hasn't come, and it's the gray of the dawn, and I've 2 children asleep and a day's work coming. Was there anything the king wants that's worth my mourning? She was good, she was very good. 6 years of being no one had taught her to lie the way I had once been taught to fight, from the bones out. And it very nearly worked. The lean man leaned back, half-satisfied, and I let myself breathe, and then the second rider, who had said nothing, who had been looking past her into the room with a slow, careful hunter's patience, said quietly, 2 children. The tally in Faromir says the widow Mar has twins, boy and a girl of an age. He looked at his smiling friend. 6 years old they'd be. Come up the river 6 years back. And I watched the smile change on the first man's face into something that was not a smile at all, because 6 years back was the year we do not speak of, the year of the Marsh murders, the year Voron's riders went from town to town cutting the throats of marked children, and this man had ridden in that year, and he remembered his arithmetic. Let's have a look at your little ones, mother, the lean man said, and put his hand flat on the door. I have replayed the next few moments 10,000 times, and I could not tell you now which of us moved first. I came off the wall. Asen threw her weight back against the door. And the wolf that had slept in me for 6 dead years came up all at once, whole roaring, the way a river comes over a broken dam, and I did not change shape. There was no room and no time, but I did not need to. I am what the moon made me. When I took the lean man by the front of his jerkin and put him into the doorframe, the whole cottage shook, and he looked into my face at a hand's breadth, and he saw what I was before he saw who I was, and the smile went out of him like a snuffed wick. The second man got his knife half drawn. I do not enjoy telling this part, so I will tell it plainly and once. It was quick, and it was quiet, because 2 children slept in the loft above us. And when it was done, there were 2 of Voron's riders on Asen's clean floor who would not carry any tale back down the river, and the third was still in the road with the horses, not yet knowing his mourning had ended. Asen did not scream. She did not weep or freeze. She looked at the 2 dead men on her floor, and she looked at me standing over them, breathing hard with the old killing calm draining out of me. And then she did the thing that told me, more than anything in that whole impossible day, who she had become in 6 years without me. She stepped over the bodies, went to the loft ladder, and called up in a voice as steady as stone, Corin, Ren, boots and cloaks, my loves, we're going on our adventure, the one we practiced, quick and quiet like mice. Bring your wolves. And to me, low, without looking round. There's a third in the road, deal with him and bring the horses. We won't get another gift like 3 of them and no more. By full light there will be 20. There was a third in the road, I dealt with him. I am not proud of that morning, and I will not dress it up for you. I only tell you that every man who fell to my hand that day had come to cut the throats of my children, and I would do it again with my own last breath, and the moon that made me does not fault a wolf for standing over the den. When I came back leading the 3 horses, Asen had the children down and cloaked, and a satchel on her own back, packed, I understood, years ago, packed and repacked and kept always by the door, because a woman who has hidden marked children for 6 years lives every single day 1 knock from running. She had known this morning would come. She had simply never known it would come with me in the room. We went out over the garden wall in the last of the dark, and we left the blue door standing open behind us, and I have never gone back to see what became of that cottage, though I think of the wren in the eaves sometimes and hope it found other rafters. I will not walk you league by league through the 3 days that followed, because a flight is a flight, cold and wet and endless, and full of the particular terror of moving 2 small children through country that wants to kill them. I will tell you only the things that mattered. I will tell you that Corin, who had been afraid of me in the garden, fell asleep against my chest on the 2nd night with my cloak over him and 1 small fist knotted in my shirt, and that I sat awake till dawn under a dripping pine holding him, and could not for the life of me have told you whether the wet on my face was rain. I will tell you that Ren, my daughter, my Ren, watched me for 2 full days with her mother's measuring gray eyes and said not 1 word to me, and then on the 3rd day, apropos of nothing, she held up her little carved wolf and said, "This one's called Grandfather. Mama says he was a king. Are you a king?" and that I had to look away into the trees a while before I could answer her. And I will tell you that on the second day, riding, Asen finally made me say the rest of it. She had let me be her mate again in the small ways that come back on their own, a hand steadying her at a ford, the old easy silence. But she had not yet let me be the king, and the king was the thing that was going to get us all killed or crowned, and she knew it. So she brought her horse up alongside mine where the children could not hear, and she said, "You have to tell me what you mean to do. Because I know you, Riston Vale, dead or living I know you, and you are not running us to some quiet border to grow old. You're running us toward Heikarn. You mean to take the seat back." "I mean to keep our children alive," I said. "Everything else follows from that." "Don't," she said, and there was an old grief in it. "Don't you dare wrap it in the children like a flag. I carried them alone for 6 years to keep them out of exactly this. If we run for the mountains tonight, we could be over the border in a week, and Vorin could keep his stolen chair, and the 3 of them, the 4 of us, could simply live. You understand that? We could simply live. That is a thing that is still on the table, and I need you to look at it and tell me honestly why it isn't the thing you're choosing." It was a fair question, and it deserved a true answer, and I made myself give her one. "Because Vorin will never stop," I said. "You know it, or you'd not have run for 6 years. A false king with a marked heir alive in the world does not sleep, and the border is not far enough, and the sea was not far enough. Look, I crossed the whole sea and grief came with me. There is no country far enough to raise our children in peace while that man wears my father's crown and knows they breathe. The only place on this earth where Corin and Ren will ever truly be safe is on the far side of Vorin being finished. That is the plain, hard shape of it. I don't run us toward Heikarn because I want the chair. I swear to you by the moon that made us both, I would burn the wolf's seat to cinders and live in a hut with the 4 of us if that would buy their safety. It won't. This will. That's all it is." She was quiet a long way down the trail. The children's voices came thin behind us, arguing over which wolf was fastest. And at last she said, not warmly but truly, which was better, "All right. Then we do it properly, not as a fugitive throwing herself on the moot's mercy. If we walk into Heikarn, we walk in with everything, the marks, the ancestor-wolves, the whole truth Vorin has spent 6 years burying. We make it so the pack cannot unsee it. Half a proof will get our children killed, Riston, all the way or not at all." "All the way," I said. And on the 3rd night, as if the ancestors themselves had heard the bargain struck, the fever came for my son. It came on him fast, the way fevers take the small, bright, and burning by the time we thought to worry. His cheeks flushed, his breath gone quick and shallow, and by moonrise he was shivering in his mother's arms and not rightly knowing where he was. Asen is a healer. She had herbs in the satchel and knowledge in her hands, and she did everything that could be done with river water and a cold cloth and steeped bark. And still I watched the fear come up in her that I had never seen there before, not at the door with 2 riders on the step, not over the garden wall in the dark. This was the fear that no amount of courage answers. He was so small in her arms. He was so hot. And we were 3 days into a wilderness with a false king's men behind us, and no roof, and no fire we dared build large. I am ashamed to tell you what I felt in that hour, but I will, because this saga is a true accounting and not a song. I felt the old thing rise up, the thing that had lain me down in the ashes of Kelvhalo and would not let me get up. I had found them alive by a miracle I did not deserve, and now I sat in the dark and watched the fever take my son 3 days into knowing him, and some cracked voice in the back of my soul said, "See, this is what hope is. This is the full table set before the starving man so that the losing of it can finish what the first loss began." I held my daughter. Ren had crept into my lap without a word, too frightened to keep her distance any longer, and I looked at my burning boy and I thought, I cannot survive losing them a second time. I do not have it in me. Whatever the moon built me to bear, it did not build me for that. And Ren, against my chest, small and grave, felt me shaking and put her hand flat over the crescent mark at her own throat the way I suppose her mother had taught her to do when she was frightened, to feel that it was there, to feel that she was who she was. And where her small palm covered the mark, it began to shine. I have seen the ancestor marks glow before. It happens under the full moon in the deep places when the blood is high, a faint cold silver, the moon answering its own. But this was no full moon, and we were under dripping pines, and the light that came up under my daughter's hand was not faint. It filled the little hollow between the trees like held breath. And Corin, in his mother's arms across from us, burning and shivering, stirred, and the mark at his throat woke too, silver, answering his sisters the way 2 struck bells answer one another across a valley. A sen went utterly still. And out of the dark between the trees, drawn by the light of the marks, or by the blood, or by the plain need of two veiled children under an open sky, the pale host came. They are not living wolves. I want to be clear so that you do not think I am telling a wolf tale. They are the ancestor-wolves, the dead of the line, the ones who answered the first veil on the first night when the moon made the bargain with our blood, and they come as shapes of cold silver light, wolves the size of ponies, soundless, with eyes like winter stars, and no false king has been able to call them in 6 years because false blood cannot. They came out of the trees 1 and 2 and then a dozen, and they made a ring of pale light around my children, and they lay down. That is all. They lay down around Corin and Ren in a living wall of dead kings, and the smallest of them, no bigger than a real wolf, silver gray, came and put its ghost nose against my burning son's cheek. And I swear to you on everything I have left that his shivering eased. Asen looked at me across the silver light with tears standing in her eyes and 6 years falling off her face, and she said, so quietly I felt it more than heard it, "They know them. Riston, the ancestors know your children. Whatever else is true, whatever Vorin has bought and stolen and burned, this he cannot touch. The host came to Corin and Ren in the wild with no throne and no witnesses and nothing but their blood. They are true. They are true, and no man alive can make it otherwise." The fever broke before dawn. I do not say the host healed him. Asen would say it was the bark and the cold cloths and the fever running its course, and she is a healer and I am only a king, so perhaps she is right. But I know what I saw. I know that my son slept sound in a ring of silver light with the dead of his line lying watch around him, and that when the sun came up they thinned into the morning mist one by one and were gone, and that I was not, after that night, ever again quite able to believe I would lose him. The old cracked voice went quiet. Something older and better spoke over it. We were true, and the true blood does not walk this earth unwitnessed. We came down out of the high country on the 4th day into the valley of a man I had to gamble everything on. And I should tell you about Bram Holt before I tell you how he nearly ended us. Bram Holt had been my father's shieldman, and then mine, the closest thing to an uncle I had. A huge gray slab of a wolf who had taught me to hold a blade and to hold my tongue and to hold the moot, and who had ridden south with me to the war, and so far as I knew, come home again after. He held a steading in the western dales, an old defensible pile called Greywater with a good pack of true wolves sworn to him, and if any man in the reach still remembered Riston Vale with love rather than as a dead banner, it was Bram. I had staked our whole plan on him. Walk into Highcarn cold, and the moot would have us cut down as impostors before the marks could be read. But come to the moot behind Bram Holt, with Bram's word and Bram's wolves and Bram's 50 years of honor vouching the children true, that was a thing the pack would have to hear. So we came to Greywater's gate wet and hunted and hoping, and Bram came out onto the wall and looked down at me for a long, long moment, and his old face broke, and he came down and took me into his arms like a son come back from the grave, which I suppose I was. For a day it was the safest I had felt in 6 years. Bram wept over the children. He roared for hot water and dry clothes and a real fire and a whole roasted deer, and he bounced Ren on his knee and let Corin, recovered ravenous, his usual quick self, climb him like a tree, and he sat late with Asen and me and swore on his father's cairn that Greywater's spears were mine, that he had never once bent his knee to Vorin in his heart, that he had only endured the usurper these 6 years for lack of any true king to rise for. He laid out the whole board for us, where Vorin was strong, where he was hated, which of the old houses would come if a true Vale raised the banner, how the moot might be called and forced to look at the marks. It was everything I had prayed for. I went to sleep that night in a real bed with my mate's hand in mine and my children safe under a friend's roof, and I thought, we might truly do this. We might live. I have learned since that the safest a hunted man ever feels is the last hour before the trap. It was Asen who caught it, of course it was Asen, who had survived 6 years by trusting no roof too far. She woke me in the black middle of the night with her hand hard over my mouth and her eyes wide in the dark, and she breathed, "Riders in the lower yard, gray and black, and the gate stood open for them, Riston." Nobody forced the gate, and I lay there in Bram Holt's guest bed with my whole heart turning to cold stone, and I heard it too, the soft, ordered movement of armed men who had been let in, the particular quiet of a betrayal in progress. And I understood, all at once and far too late, why an old wolf who had endured Vorin for 6 years still had a whole steading and a fat pack and a warm fire while the rest of the reach starved. Bram Holt had not endured the usurper. Bram Holt had made his peace with him. And into that peace I had walked with the one thing Voren wanted most in all the world. 2 marked children and the dead king to go with them, delivered to a friend's warm hall and asleep in a friend's soft bed. We did not run for the door. There is a thing you learn, hunting and being hunted, that the door is where they wait. Asen had the children awake and silent. She woke them the way she did everything now, with a touch and a word that turned terror into obedience. And I stood in the dark of that guest room and made myself think, not as a cornered man, but as the king I had stopped being, because cornered men die and kings sometimes do not. Bram had put us in the East Tower high with one stair down. The stair was where the men were. But Bram Holt had built Greywater, and I had spent half my boyhood in it. And I remembered, the moon be thanked, I remembered that the East Tower had a second way. A mural stair inside the thickness of the wall that the old lord had used to walk his ramparts unseen, and that it came out low on the north curtain above the mill-leat, where the water ran fast and deep and cold. I got the wall panel open with my knife and the strength the wolf gives, and we went down inside the wall in the black. Asen first with Ren on her back, then Corin between us with his fist in my belt, then me. And I pulled the panel to behind us so that when they came into the empty room they would find the bed still warm and no door and think, for a few precious minutes, that they had lost their minds. We came out on the north curtain into a thin, cold rain, and below us the mill-leat ran black and loud, and there was no way down to it but to go into it, and it was a long drop and a hard cold water, and my children were 6 years old. I will tell you what my daughter did because I want it remembered. Ren looked over the wall at the black water a long way down, and she looked at her mother, and she looked at me, and she was afraid. She was only a little girl, and any creature with sense is afraid of that drop, but she reached up and put her hand over the mark at her throat, the way she does, and she said in a small, fierce whisper, "The grandfathers came for Corin. Will they come if we fall?" And Asen, God keep her, did not lie to comfort her. She said, "They came for you both in the wild with nothing. They will not stop now. But I have you, Ren. Whatever the water does, I will not let go of you, and neither will your father let go of your brother, and we go together." And my daughter nodded once and put her arms around her mother's neck, and we went off the north wall of Greywater into the dark together, all 4 of us, before the shouting even started above. The cold of that water is with me still. It drove the breath out of me, and I lost the sky and the up of it, and for one endless black moment I could not find my son's hand. And then his fist found my collar again, small and desperate and alive. And I got an arm around him and my feet under me on the mill-race gravel and my head into the air. And I heard Asen cough and gasp somewhere in the roaring dark, and heard her say Ren's name, and heard a small voice answer it. And the 4 of us were down, and down was better than up. Because the leat ran fast away from the walls into the mill pool, and the mill pool spilled into the river, and the river ran west, away from Greywater, away from Bram Holt's warm, treacherous hall, into the dark, cold country that did not love us, but at least did not pretend to. We came out a mile downriver in a willow brake, shuddering, blue-lipped. Everything we owned lost but the clothes on us, and the little wolves the children would not let go of even in the flood. I got a fire going small under the willows, because cold could kill the children now surer than any rider, and we huddled the 4 of us around it, while the sky grayed toward a dawn we had no right to have lived to see. And I looked at my family, soaked, hunted, robbed of the one ally I had staked everything on, 3 days further from Heikarn than we had been, and no friend left in the whole reach that I dared trust. And I felt the plan I had built lying in pieces around us like the wreck of Greywater's hospitality. It was Asen who put it back together, and it is here I think that I stopped being the leader of our small band and became merely half of it, which is what I should have been from the first hour of the first day. She sat close by the little fire with Ren asleep against her at last and Corin's head in her lap, and she looked into the flames a long while, and then she said, "We've been thinking about this wrong, both of us, you especially." She said it without heat. "You've been trying to find a strong man to stand behind, Bram, an old house, someone with wolves, so that when you walk into the moot, you walk in with a shield in front of you. And every strong man in this reach has spent 6 years learning which way the wind blows, and the wind blows from the wolf's seat, and so every shield you reach for will turn in your hand. Bram is not the last Bram. He is the first of many. We cannot win this by borrowing another man's strength." "Then we cannot win it," I said low, because I was tired and cold and my son was shivering in her lap. "I am one wolf, Asen, a strong one, not strong enough to take a fortified seat and a crowned king and a sworn moot with one blade and no house behind me." "No," she agreed. "You can't, But you are thinking of the wrong strength, and so is Voren, which is the whole reason we might live. Listen to me." She lifted Corin's chin gently and turned his sleeping face to the firelight, to the crescent and star at his throat. "Voren has spent 6 years and a fortune buying men, every strong man in the Reach, and it has bought him a crown and a fortress and a moot that will do as it's told. But it has not bought him the one thing that makes a king in the eyes of the pack, the thing no coin can buy and no fortress can hold. The ancestors will not answer him. 6 years and the Pale Host has never once come to the wolf seat for Voren Ashgard. The whole Reach knows it. They follow him anyway because they believe the true line is dead and a false king who feeds them is better than a war over a grave. But they follow him ashamed, Riston. They follow him with a splinter in the paw, and you have walked out of the wild with the very thing that pulls the splinter." She looked up at me. "You don't need a strong man's shield. You need the whole pack in one place looking when the host comes to your children. That's the only battle we can win, and it's the only one that ends this for good. Not a fight at the gate, a witnessing in the hall." I looked at her and I saw it, the whole shape of it, clean and terrible and right, and I saw, too, the cost that she had already counted and I had not yet dared to. "The only place the whole pack gathers," I said slowly, "is the moot, and the only moot Voren cannot refuse to call." "Is his own crowning," Asen said. "Yes, you didn't know out on the road. I heard it in Faramir the week before you came. He's held the seat 6 years as regent, as steward, always the man keeping the chair warm until the line is confirmed dead. The pack made him swear that at the start, that he'd hold in trust, not rule in blood, until the true line was proven ended. And now he's decided the 6 years are up. At the turn of this next moon, he means to call the full moot to Heikarn, declare the Vale line extinct before all the houses, and have himself crowned true king of the Iron Moon in blood and not in trust. Every wolf of standing in the Reach will be in that hall. He's gathering them to bury us." She smiled, and it was not a soft smile. It was the smile of the woman who had lain 2 days in the marsh reeds to keep her babies from the knife. "So we let him gather them. And then in the 1 hour he has assembled the entire pack to declare your children dead. We bring your children into the hall alive, and we let the ancestors do the rest. We had 12 days until the moon turned, and 100 cold leagues of hostile country between the Willow Brake and the Wolf's Seat, and no coin, and no horses, and no friends. I will not pretend those 12 days were not hard. But I will tell you a truth I did not expect, which is that they were, somewhere underneath the fear, the best 12 days of my life, because they were the first I had ever spent as what I truly was, not a king, not a widower, not a sellsword wearing a dead man's grief, but a father walking his children through the world, and a man walking beside the one the moon had made for him. We moved by night and the small roads. We slept in shepherds' bothies and old shrines, and once, memorably, in the dry hollow under a fallen oak that Corin declared to be a castle and defended, all night with a stick against enemies only he could see. I taught him to carve. I had my knife and there was always deadfall wood, and on the 3rd night of the road he watched me shape a wolf for Ren to replace one lost in the flood, and he said, "Show me," in the imperious way of small boys, and I put the knife in his hand with mine around it, and we cut a wolf together badly, and it was the finest thing I have ever made. Ren came to me slower. She is her mother's daughter, and her mother does not give her trust to any man who has not earned it, dead king or living. But on the 7th night she woke from a bad dream in a cold shrine with the wind crying in the eaves, and it was to me she came, not her mother, padding across the stone floor to climb into my lap and press her face into my chest, and she said into my shirt, "You didn't die. Everyone said the grandfathers took you, but you didn't die, you were just far away." And I said, "I was very far away. I am sorry I was so far away." And she considered this with the terrible seriousness of a 6-year-old, and then she forgave me wholly in the way only children can, and she said, "You can carry me tomorrow if you want," and fell asleep. And I sat in the crying dark with my daughter's whole trusting weight against me, and understood that whatever happened at Heikarn, I had already been given more than a man in my case had any right to ask. And Asen, I must try to say this rightly, because it is the marrow of the whole tale and the easiest thing to say wrongly. We had been mates before the war, fated and married and joyous, and then 6 years of 2 graves had come down between us, and you do not simply step back across a thing like that. She had lived a whole life without me. She had made herself into someone who did not need me, had to, or she and the children would have died. And I loved that someone, the widow Mar who lied to riders and lay in the marsh reeds and carried a packed satchel by the door for 6 years. I loved her fiercely and separately from the girl I had married, and I had to court her all over again, gently, without a single claim, because a man who comes back from the dead has no rights, only the chance to earn them. So I did not reach for her. I let her reach, and slowly over those 12 nights, she did a shoulder leaned against mine at a cold fire, her hand finding my hand as we watched the children sleep. And on the 10th night, under a clearing sky with the moon 2 days from full and the marks warm at both our throats, she turned her face up to me and let me kiss her once, and it was not the kiss of 2 young mates in a warm hall, but something harder one, and I think better. The kiss of 2 people who had each crossed a whole country of grief to arrive, against all odds, back at the other's mouth. That was all. We were fugitives with 2 children asleep an arm's length away, and a war to walk into. There was no time and no place for more, and neither of us wanted more just then than the plain miracle of the other being warm and living and there. But something that had been torn out of me 6 years ago in the ashes of Kelvhalo came home to me on that 10th night, and it has never left again. We were not, in the end, entirely without friends. This is the thing Voren never understood, that Asen understood in her bones from 6 years of it, that the great houses could be bought, but the small folk could not, because Voren had never once thought them worth the buying. As we came down out of the west into the settled country near Heirs, we found the truth of it. A shepherd who guessed what the mark at Corin's throat meant did not run to the gray and black riders for the reward. He hid us in his fold and gave us his own supper and said only, "My grandfather served the true king. Feed my king's children and say nothing, that's all I ask of it." A ferryman took us over the Carn water by night and would not take our nothing for it. An old moon priestess named Elsk, who kept a half-ruined shrine in the woods above the seat, took one look at Asen's face across her fire, for she had known Asen long ago, when Asen was queen, and then at the 2 dark children with the marks at their throats, and she wept, and she got up off her knees a different woman, and she said, "I have poured out 6 years of libations to a dead line and hated every drop for the lie in it. The host has not come to that stolen hall in all that time, and I have had to stand and pretend I did not notice. Tell me what you mean to do, my queen, and this old woman will do her part or die of it." And it was Elsk who gave us the last piece we needed. The piece I had not known was missing, for she was a keeper of the old law, and she knew the forms of the moot as no warrior did, and she told us the one thing that turned our desperate hope into a blade. "He cannot refuse the right of witness," she said. "It is the oldest law of the Ironmoon, older than the seat itself. When the crowning-moot is called, before the crown is set, any wolf of the blood may stand and claim the right, may demand that the ancestors themselves be called to witness the truth of the line before the pack. Voren will have to allow it or shame himself before every house as a man afraid of his own ancestors, and a man afraid of the host cannot be king. They will not follow him a heartbeat past that fear, so he must allow it. He must stand in his own crowning hall and call the host to witness, and the host will not come for him. They never have, and he knows it, and he has been dreading that empty summons for 6 years. That is why he waited. He has spent 6 years making certain no true blood remains alive to stand and claim the right, so that when he calls the host and they do not come, there will be no one to say what their silence means. He will call and they will not answer, and he will smile and say the ancestors sleep and the age of the host is past, and no living soul in that hall will be able to prove him a liar." Her old eyes burned. "Unless a true child of the line is standing in the hall when he calls, then the host will come not for him, for the child, and every wolf in the reach will see the ancestors of the Ironmoon walk into Voren Ashgard's crowning and lie down at the feet of Riston Vale's children. And that, my king, is a thing no fortress and no coin and no sworn moot in the world can survive." The plan was Elsk's forms and Asen's cunning and my old knowledge of the seat, laid together over 3 nights in the ruined shrine, while the moon fattened toward full. On the day of the crowning-moot, every house of the Reach would come up the Carn road to Heirs, and the great wolf hall would fill with more wolves than had stood in one place since before the war, and the gates that were shut against an army would stand open to the guests. We would come in among them. Not as ourselves, Elsk and the moon priestesses had the right of it, for on a crowning day the priestesses walk in procession in gray hoods, faces down, and no man lays a hand on a moon priestess, and no man counts them. Asen would walk in the procession hooded as a priestess. The children would come in the great covered libation basket that the priestesses carry, that no profane hand may open. Corin and Ren, small and quiet, hidden among the offering cloths, brought into the very heart of the hall under Voron's nose by the one thing his whole reign had taught him to ignore. And I could not pass for a priestess, being what I am. I would come in among the house guards of one of the lesser Western families that Elsk swore still had true hearts, in borrowed gray and black, one more spear along the wall until the hour of the rite. And when Voron rose to be crowned, and the right of witness was claimed, Elsk herself would claim it, being a priestess of the old law and beyond his reach to silence. Then Asen would put back her hood, and I would come off the wall, and the children would rise up out of the offering basket in the sight of the whole pack. And Voron Ashgard would be made to call the host in front of every wolf in the reach, and the ancestors would come for my children, and it would end. It was a good plan. I want that written down because of what came after. It was a good plan, and it was Asen's, and it should have worked. And the reason it did not is the reason I will carry to my cairn. We did not know that Bram Holt had lived. I had thought I had let myself think, which is a different and more dangerous thing. That when we went off the north wall of Greywater into the flood, we had left Bram behind us clean, a betrayer with nothing but a wet, empty tower to show his master. But Bram Holt was no fool, whatever else he was, and he had spent a lifetime learning to read me, and when he stood in that empty guest room and understood that I had gone through the wall he had built, he understood something else too, that a man does not flee 100 cold leagues from his own kingdom. He knew I would go to Heirs. He knew, because he knew me, that I would find some way into the crowning-moot, and being Bram, he even guessed the shape of it, for he had stood 100 crowning days and knew what walks in unhindered on such a morning. And he sold that guess to Voron for the price of his own gray neck. So when we came up the Cairn Road on the morning of the moot among the crowd and the carts and the gray procession of priestesses, Voron Ashgard already knew that the true king would try to come in that day among the guests, and that a priestess who was not a priestess, and a covered basket that must not be opened, were the things to watch for. I felt it go wrong the moment we passed the gate. Heirs was my father's house and mine, and I know its gates the way I know my own hands, and there were too many spears on the wall for a day of welcome, and the men on the gate were not counting guests. They were reading faces, and I saw a house captain in gray and black lean and say a low word to a runner, and the runner go up the inner stair fast. I could not warn Asen. She was ahead of me in the procession, hooded, her hand steady on the great libation basket where our children lay hidden and silent among the cloths, trusting the plan, trusting the forms, trusting that no man lays hand on a moon priestess. And the whole trap was that Voron had decided that morning to be the first king in 300 years who would. They took the procession in the inner ward, before it ever reached the hall, in the shadow of the wolf gate where I had learned to walk as a boy. It was done fast and hard and everywhere at once, the way you spring a trap you have had days to set. Gray and black men came out of every stair and door, and hands did lay hold of the moon priestesses, and I heard old Elsk cry out the profanation of it in a voice like a breaking tree, and I came off my place along the wall with my borrowed spear and the wolf roaring up in me. But I was one man in a courtyard full of Voron's chosen, and they had known I would come, and they had men enough placed for nothing but me. I put 2 of them down. I did not put down the 6 behind them, nor the club that came out of the press and took me across the back of the skull. And the last thing I saw as the cobbles of my father's courtyard came up to meet me was a gray-gloved hand closing on Asen's hood and dragging it back, and her white face turning, and her mouth shaping my name, not in fear for herself, I knew even falling, but in warning, in grief, in the old unbearable love of her. And then the courtyard went out like a snuffed candle, and I fell into the dark I had been running from for 6 years. I do not know how long I was gone. When I came back to myself, I was in the black under the wolf hall, in the old stone cells cut into the hill where my father had kept his few prisoners, chained at the wrist to a ring in the wall, my head a single great wound of pain, and I was alone, utterly alone. And the bond in my chest, the bond that had roared back to life in Asen's garden and burned warm through 12 nights on the road. The bond told me she was alive, still alive, somewhere above me in the hall, and it told me nothing else, and that was worse than silence, because I could feel her there and could not reach her, could feel her fear coming down through the stone like cold water, and I could not answer it. That was the hour I broke. I will not hide it from you, because a saga that hides the low place is a lie, and I have told you no lies. I sat chained in the dark under my own hall with my head broken and my mate above me in a usurper's hands and my 2 children. Where were my children? I did not know. The basket. Had they taken the basket? had a gray hand thrown back the offering cloths in that courtyard and found two dark heads with the marks at their throats? Were they alive? Was Wren alive, who had put her hand over her mark in the willow brake and asked if the grandfathers would come? Was Corin alive, who had carved a wolf with my hand around his? I could not feel them the way I felt a sen. The bond runs mate to mate, not father to child, and so I sat in the dark with a hole in me where their small living warmth should have been and no way on this earth to know. And the old cracked voice that had lain me down in the ashes of Kelvalo came back, and this time it did not whisper. It filled the whole black cell, and it said, "You were shown them alive so that the losing of them could finish you. You knew it. You knew from the first that hope was the full table set before the starving man. You have led your fated mate and your two children into the exact jaws you swore to keep them from, delivered them yourself, warm and trusting, into Vorin Ashgard's hall, and now you will sit chained in the dark and feel them die one by one above you. And that is the whole meaning of your coming back from the sea, not to save them, but to be the hand that carried them to the knife. I have been hurt in my life. I have been broken and burned and buried. I have never in all of it hurt as I hurt in that black hour, chained under my father's hall, feeling my mate's fear through the stone, and not knowing if my children still breathed. The wound that had opened in Asen's garden and closed in the same breath, the old wound of losing her, it tore open again in that cell, all the way to the bone, and this time nothing closed it. This time it only bled. Vorin came down to me himself on the evening before the crowning. I had forgotten in 6 years how much he looked like my father's side of the house, the same iron gray at the temples, the same heavy, careful hands, and I hated that most of all, that the thief wore a stolen face along with the stolen crown. He came with a lamp and 2 guards and had them set a stool outside my reach, and he sat and looked at me chained in the dark a long while, and there was no triumph in his face, which unsettled me more than any gloating could have. Vorin Ashgard was tired. 6 years of a stolen chair had worn him down to something gray and joyless, a man who had climbed a mountain to find nothing at the top of it, and I understood, looking at him, that he had never once been glad of what he took. "You should have stayed dead, cousin," he said at last, without heat. "I did not want this. I want you to know that, for whatever a dead man's knowing is worth. When the war took you, I held the seat in trust, truly, as I swore I meant to give it back to the line. And then the years went on, and there was no line to give it to, and the reach needed a hand on the tiller, and a man gets used to the weight of a crown the way he gets used to a wound, until taking it off would kill him quicker than keeping it on." He looked at his heavy hands. "I did the marsh work myself the first year, the marked children. I have never told anyone that. I told the pack it was rogue lichens, wartime lawlessness, it was me. Because I knew I have always known that the host would never answer me, and that as long as one true-blood child breathed, my whole reign was a held breath waiting to be let out. So I let out the breath of every marked child I could find, and I told myself it was for the peace of the reach, and I have not slept a whole night since." His gray eyes came up to mine, and there was something almost like pleading in them, which was the most terrible thing of all. "And now here you are with 2 of them, 2, alive, after I burned a whole marsh country of other men's children, to be sure. Do you understand what you have done to me, Riston? You have made all of it for nothing. Every child, every sleepless night, the whole black weight of it for nothing, because the 2 that mattered lived anyway." "Then give it back," I said. My voice came out of me cracked and low. "Let the breath out for good. You said you meant to give the seat back to the line. The line is standing in your hall. Give it back and let my family go, and I will speak for you before the moot myself. I swear it on my father's cairn, Vorin. I will beg them to spare you. You are tired. Be tired. Set it down." For one moment, one single moment, I saw him want to. I saw the whole exhausted length of him lean toward it like a man toward a warm bed. And then I watched him step back from the edge of it, and his face closed, and I knew we were both damned, because a man who has done the marsh work cannot lay down the crown and live, and he knew it, and I knew it, and there was no road left between us that did not run through blood. "I cannot," he said quietly. "You know I cannot. If I set it down, the pack will remember the children and ask what became of the others, and the answer is a thing no king survives the speaking of. So this is what will be, cousin, and I am sorry for it, more sorry than you will believe. Tomorrow I am crowned. Your priestess Elsk has claimed the right of witness. Oh yes, I must let her. The law is the law, and tomorrow before all the houses I will call the host, and they will not come, and I will say the age of the ancestors is ended, and I will be believed, because the only mouths that could name my lie will be silent." He rose and gathered his lamp. "Your children are alive. I have not touched them. I am not the monster the songs will make me. They are alive, and your queen is alive, and they will stay alive exactly as long as they are silent and hidden, because a dead heir is a martyr and a rallying cry, but a secret heir is only a secret, and I have kept secrets before. Tomorrow I am crowned true king. And the day after, you and your queen and your two marked children will go quietly to a high cold place I keep for such things, and the world will go on believing the veil line died in the war, and I will not sleep, and the Reach will have its peace. He turned to go. I truly am sorry, Riston. I mourned you honestly. I only found, when you came back, that I had grown too used to the wound to take it off. And he left me in the dark, and I heard the great door of the cell block boom shut, and I sat with the knowledge that on the morrow he would parade my whole living family up to a cold high place to die in secret, and that the one plan we had that might have saved them was already sprung and broken in the courtyard, and that I was chained to a ring in the wall of my father's house with a broken head, and no key, and no friend, and no hope. But I had forgotten Elsk, and I had forgotten, worse, the thing that Voron had spent 6 years teaching himself to forget, that the small folk were not nothing, and that a moon priestess walks where kings do not think to look. It was past the middle of the night when I heard the soft scrape at the cell door, and the little sound of a key that should not have existed turning in a lock that should have held me. Old Elsk came in out of the dark with a stolen ring of keys and a face like carved stone, and behind her, to my everlasting astonishment, came Halla of the drowned otter, the innkeeper of Faramir, 100 cold leagues from her own hearth, and I learned then the thing about the small folk that Voron never learned in 6 years of buying great ones. That word runs downriver faster than any king's rider, mother to mother, hearth to hearth, and that when it ran through the Reach that the true queen's children were taken into Highcarn to die, the small folk of the Ironmoon had begun, quietly, without any lord to lead them, to come. Not in an army. The small folk have no army. They came the way water comes, one and one and one, a ferryman here and a shepherd there, and an innkeeper who had closed her in and walked 100 leagues because a road-worn stranger had once said please to her. And Elsk, keeper of the old law, had gathered them in the shrine above the seat. And now she had come down into the hill for the one thing that could turn all that quiet water into a flood. On your feet, my king, she said, working the shackle at my wrist with the stolen key. The host does not come for a chained man weeping in the dark. It comes for the one who stands. Your children are alive and above us, and I know where. Your queen is alive, and I know where. And tomorrow the whole pack of the Ironmoon will be gathered in your father's hall by a man who thinks he has buried the last true blood in the Reach. The shackle fell open. She looked at me in the lamplight, this small, fierce, ancient woman, and she said the thing that got me off the floor of that cell and has kept me on my feet every hard day since. He is right that the dead heir is a martyr and the secret heir is only a secret. So be neither. Be the thing he cannot survive. Walk into that hall in the sight of every house of the Ironmoon and be alive. Getting to my family was the work of the darkest hours, and I owe every step of it to people whose names the songs will never carry. Elsk knew the hill under the hall the way I knew the hall above it, for the priestesses keep the old undercrofts, and she led me by ways I had not known existed in my own father's house, up through the wine vaults, along a mural passage behind the great hearth where the stone was warm on one side, and out at last into a servant's stair. Voron had put us Sen in the queen's own chambers, which I think now was another sign of the man's exhausted conscience, for he might have thrown her in a cell and did not. He had shut my mate in the rooms that were rightfully hers and set 2 guards on the door and called it keeping. Halla and 2 of Elsk's shepherds dealt with the guards, quietly, without killing, for these were only Reach men doing a paid duty, and the night had blood enough coming. And I went through the door into the queen's chambers and found a Sen standing in the dark with a fire iron in her 2 hands, ready to open the skull of the first gray and black man who came for her. And when she saw it was me, the iron fell out of her hands and rang on the stone, and she came into my arms so hard it drove the breath out of us both. The children, I said into her hair because I had to know before I could feel anything else. Sen, the basket, did they? They're safe, Riston, they're here. She pulled back to look at me and her face was streaked and fierce. The priestesses got the basket away in the courtyard when the trap sprang. They closed ranks around it and carried it off in the confusion as though it were only the offering, and no man dared open a covered libation basket in the sight of the whole procession, not even Voron's, the forms held even when everything else broke. Elsk has had them hidden with the Moon Women since. They think it's all a great game of hiding. Corin has told everyone he meets that he is going to be a king, and Ren has told him to be quiet or the game is spoiled. A sound came out of her that was half a laugh and half a sob. They're alive. They're whole. And you're alive, you came? I felt you above me in the stone all through that day, and I could not reach you, and it was the worst of everything. Worse than the courtyard, feeling you there. I know, I said. I felt you. I know. And for a moment we simply held on, the two of us, in the dark of the rooms that had been ours before the world broke, and the bond that Voron's stone had muffled all day ran clear and warm between us again, and the old wound that had torn open in the cell finally began once more to close. They brought the children to us before dawn, muffled and sleepy and cross at being woken, and I held my son and my daughter in the queen's chambers of Heirs and did not let go of them for a long time. And then, because there was no time and the moon was full that night, and the crowning-moot would fill the great hall by noon, we made the last plan, not the broken one, the new one, the one built out of the pieces of the old by an ancient priestess and an innkeeper and a queen who had never once in 6 years run out of courage. We would not sneak in. That was the change, and it was everything. Voron had beaten the sneaking plan because a sneaking plan can be betrayed and sprung in a courtyard. But he could not spring a thing that walked in openly in front of the whole assembled pack, because the whole assembled pack was the trap we meant to set for him. Elsk had the right of the old law and Halla had the truth of the small folk, and here is what they had built between them while I sat chained in the dark. The crowning-moot was open, by the oldest custom, to every wolf of the Ironmoon who cared to stand along the walls and witness the making of a king. And all through the night the small folk had been coming up the Carn Road, the ferrymen and shepherds and river wives and old soldiers, quiet as water, until by the gray of the morning the walls of my father's hall were lined 3 deep with the common wolves of the Reach, come to witness a crowning, exactly as the law allowed. And Voron could not turn them out without declaring before all his great houses that he feared his own people on the day he claimed to be their king. He had spent 6 years believing the small folk were nothing, and so he had let a hall full of them assemble around his throne, and he did not know that every one of them had walked a hard road that night for one reason, because word had run down river that the true queen's children were alive in Heirs, and the wolves of the Ironmoon had come to see it with their own eyes. We would walk in among them, and when the right of witness was called and Voron rose to call the host that would not come for him, Asen and I would come out of the crowd of common folk with our children between us, into the open floor of the hall, in the full sight of every house and every witness, and the usurper on the stolen chair. And we would let Voron call the ancestors, and we would let the ancestors answer. He'll have his guards, I said. The moment we show ourselves, he'll try to cut us down before the host can come. That's the whole danger of it, Asen. Between the showing and the answering there's a gap, and in that gap he has 100 swords and we have the truth, and the truth is slow and swords are fast. Then we make the gap small, Asen said, and we make the whole Reach watch it. He can order the swords, but he'll be ordering them in front of every house he spent 6 years buying, ordering armed men to cut down 2 children in the sight of the pack, on the crowning floor under the witness law before the host has even been called. Some of those swords will hesitate, and a king whose swords hesitate on his crowning day is already no king. She looked at me steadily. It's a risk with our children's lives on it, Riston, and I'll not pretend to you it isn't, because we swore we'd tell each other the true shape of things. But there's no safe road left. There hasn't been one since you knelt in my cabbages. This is the road with a door at the end of it. All the others end in a cold, high place, quietly, with no one watching. I would rather risk everything in the light than lose everything in the dark. I looked at my mate, who had lain in the marsh reeds and gone off the north wall of Greywater into the flood, and stood in the dark with a fire iron ready to die swinging it. And I did the thing I should have done from the first hour, which was to stop trying to shield her from the choice and simply stand beside her in it. In the light, then, I said. And she took my hand, and Corin took hers, and Ren took mine, and old Elsk drew the gray hoods up over all 4 of us one last time. And as the great bell of Heirs began to toll noon over the Reach, calling the houses to the crowning of a false king, we walked out of the queen's chambers and down toward the Wolf Hall to make an end. The Wolf Hall of Heirs is the oldest roofed place in the Reach, a great pillared cavern of gray stone with the 11 generations of Vale kings carved along its walls and the wolf's seat at the far end on its dais of black rock. And I had not stood in it in 6 years, and to come into it hooded as a nameless witness, my own hall, packed wall to wall with the whole pack of the Ironmoon, was a strange and terrible homecoming. The great houses sat in their ranks on the benches, in their furs and iron, the bought lords of 6 bought years. And along every wall, 3 and 4 deep, silent, watching, stood the small folk, hundreds of them, more than I think Voren had ever seen gathered in one place. And I felt the unease of the great houses at the sight of them, the sense of a room that had somehow filled with more than had been invited. We came in among the common folk at the back, and were only 4 more gray hoods in a hall full of them, and we waited. Voren came in with horns and his 100 guards, and mounted the dais and stood before the wolf's seat, not yet sitting in it. For the law is that a man is not king until the crowning is done. And the moot speaker read out the long gray forms, the 6 years of stewardship, the trust held, the line of veil mourned, and now, in the absence of any heir, to be declared ended, that the reach might have a true king in blood and end its long uncertainty. I watched my cousin's gray, tired face through the whole of it, and I saw that he believed he had already won, that this was only the tolling of a bell over a grave he had dug 6 years deep, and I almost pitied him, and then I remembered the marsh work and did not. Then old Elsk rose from among the priestesses, and in a voice that filled the whole great hall she claimed the right of witness. I felt the pack stir at it, for it is an old and heavy thing, rarely called, and every wolf in that hall knew what it meant, that before the crown was set, the ancestors themselves must be summoned to witness the truth of the blood. I watched Voren's face, and I will give him this, he did not flinch. He had known it was coming, had spent 6 years arranging the board so that this exact moment would find him with no true blood alive to make the host's silence mean anything. He inclined his head gravely, as a confident king should, and he said the words of the law, that he welcomed the witness of the ancestors upon his blood. And he raised his arms in the old summoning, and he called the pale host of the Iron Moon to come into the hall and witness the making of their king. And nothing came. The silence stretched. It stretched the way silence does when a whole pack is holding its breath, the great houses leaning forward, the small folk still as stone, every eye on the empty air above the wolf's seat where, in the old days, in the true days, the ancestors had always come. And nothing came. And I watched Voren let the silence run just long enough, and then compose his tired face into sorrow, and draw breath to say the lie he had built 6 years to say, that the age of the host was ended, that the ancestors slept, that the pack must make its own kings now in a world the old powers had abandoned. And Asen put back her hood. She did it in the same breath that Voren drew to speak, out in the open floor of the hall where she had walked without my quite seeing her go, and the light from the high windows fell on her face, and a sound went through the great houses like a wind through wheat, because there were lords in that hall old enough to remember the true queen of the Iron Moon, and here she stood, 6 years dead, alive on the crowning floor with the mark of the veil plain at her throat. Voren's breath died in him. And before he could find another, I put back my own hood and came out of the crowd of common folk onto the open floor beside my mate, and I heard my own name break out of 100 throats at once. Vale, Riston, the king is alive, and the whole hall came up off its benches roaring. And Voren Ashgard stood on the dais above the wolf's seat with the summoning still on his lips, and looked at the 2 dead people standing alive on his crowning floor, and I watched 6 years of stolen sleep and marsh work and gray exhaustion break over his face like a wave. But it was not the 2 of us that undid him. We were only a man and a woman, and a man and a woman can be named impostors, can be shouted down, can be cut down. I saw the thought cross his ruined face even in that instant, saw him gather himself to call us liars and ghosts and traitors. What undid him was the children. Because in the roaring and the rising, Corin and Wren put back their own small hoods and stepped out from behind their mothers' skirts into the light of the crowning floor. 2 dark-haired children with the crescent-tan star of the veil line plain at their throats, standing in the sight of the whole pack of the Iron Moon in the exact hour their deaths had been declared. And it was then, into the roar and the light and the shock of it, in answer not to Voren's summoning, but to the plain living blood of 2 true-born children standing where the ancestors could see them at last, that the pale host came. They came the way they had come in the willow brake, but there were not a dozen of them now. They came in their hundreds. They came pouring up out of the black rock of the dais itself, and down the pillared length of the hall and through the very walls where the 11 generations were carved, wolves of cold silver light, the whole dead host of the Iron Moon line, soundless, vast. Their winterstar eyes turning as one, not to Voren, never once to Voren. The man stood in the middle of them, and they passed him by as if he were empty air, but to the children, to Corin and Wren. and the great silver ancestors of the Vale, the dead kings of 11 generations, came across that hall through a usurper's crowning and lay down at the feet of 2 Rivertown children. And the smallest of them, silver gray, no bigger than a real wolf, put its ghost nose against my daughter's cheek exactly as it had done in the wild. And Wren reached up without any fear at all and laid her small hand on its head of cold light, and the whole hall of the Iron Moon fell to its knees. There is no lie a man can tell over that. There is no coin that buys it and no fortress that holds against it and no 6 years of careful murder that survives it. Every great house that had bought its comfort with silence, every bought lord, every wolf who had followed a false king with a splinter in the paw, they went down onto their knees on the stone of the wolf hall in front of the plain and blinding truth, because the ancestors of the Iron Moon had walked into a false crowning and named the true line with their own bodies, and no soul born of the old blood could kneel in that silver light and pretend not to see it. Voren saw that he was finished. I watched him see it. He stood alone on the dais in the middle of a sea of kneeling wolves and silver ancestors, the only figure in that whole vast hall still on his feet, the crown he had never quite dared to set on his own head still in the moot speaker's hands beside him. And he understood in one gray instant that 6 years of holding his breath were over, and the breath was going out of him at last, and that there was nothing left at the top of his stolen mountain but the long, cold fall. And a lesser man in the songs would have fallen with dignity. Voren did not. Because there was one thing left he might yet do, not to save his crown, that was gone, but to unmake the thing that had taken it, to reach across the ruin and tear out of the world the small living proof that had walked into his hall and undone him. I saw his hand go to the long knife at his belt. I saw his ruined gray eyes fix not on me, not on Asen, but on the 2 children kneeling in the silver light with the whole pack bowed around them. And I understood, in the frozen half-heartbeat before he moved, that Voren Ashgard had decided that if he could not have the reach, then the last true act of his broken reign would be to make certain that no child of Risten Vale would have it either. He came off the dais with the knife, straight for my son. I have relived a great many hard moments of my life, and that half-heartbeat is the one I return to most, because everything I am was decided in it. I was across the floor from my son. There were kneeling wolves and silver ancestors and 10 strides of stone between Corin and me, and Voren was closer, and Voren had the knife, and there is no version of that half-heartbeat in which I reach my child in time. I knew it as I moved. I have never in my life moved as I moved then, the whole wolf of me coming up at once, the 6 years and the sea and the grief all burning off into one single animal spring across that floor. And it was not enough. It could not be enough. I was 3 strides too far, and Voren was already on my son with the blade coming down. He was stopped by a child. Not by me, by Wren. My daughter, 6 years old, kneeling in the silver light beside her brother, saw the gray man come with the knife. And she did not run and she did not freeze. She threw herself sideways across Corin, small arms spread, putting her own body between the blade and her brother the way her mother had put her body between the marsh riders and them both. And she cried out not in fear but in fury, a sound too big for so small a chest, and where she flung out her hand, palm open, toward the man with the knife. The silver ancestor at her side rose. I have said the host does not touch the living world, that they are witnesses of cold light and no more. I believed it. Every wolf of the Iron Moon believed it. We were wrong, or else what happened was a thing that comes only once in the long life of a line, when true blood is threatened before the very eyes of the dead who love it. The silver-gray wolf that had lain at my daughter's side came up between Wren's flung-out hand and Voren's falling knife, and it was not cold light any longer. For one impossible instant it was as solid as the stone, a wall of the ancestors' own will made flesh, and Voren Ashgard's knife struck it and turned, and the man himself struck it and was thrown back as a wave is thrown from a rock, back across the crowning floor to fall at the foot of his own stolen dais in a heap, and the whole host turned. The hundreds of them, the 11 generations, the dead kings of the Iron Moon, turned their Winterstar eyes as one from the children they had come to honor to the man who had tried to spill their blood, and they began, silently, to close on him. I reached my children then. I got Corin and Wren into my arms, both of them, and Asen was there in the same instant, the 4 of us together on the floor of the wolf hall in a knot no power on earth could have opened, and over my daughter's head I watched the end of Voren Ashgard, and I will tell it truly and without relish, because there was no relish in it. The host did not tear him. They are not beasts, and neither in the end am I, whatever the songs of my enemies say. They closed around him in a ring of silver light, the fathers of the line he had usurped and the ancestors of the children he had tried to murder, and they simply looked at him, hundreds of them, silent, their cold eyes full of 6 years of marsh work and stolen sleep, and every child he had put in the ground to make himself safe. And Vorin Ashgard knelt in the center of that ring in the sight of the whole pack he had ruled, and looked up into the faces of the dead. And whatever he saw there was more than a man could carry. He made a sound I will not try to describe. And then the gray, exhausted thing that 6 years had made of my cousin simply gave way, all at once, the way a wall long undermined gives way, and he bowed down onto the stone of the hall he had stolen, and he did not rise again. The healers said after that his heart had stopped. Elsk said the ancestors had shown him the whole weight of what he had done in one unbearable instant, and that no heart could bear it. I think they are both right. I think that is what it is to be undone, not to be struck down, but to be made, finally, wholly to see. He had said he could not lay the crown down and live. In the end the crown was lifted from him by the dead, and he could not bear the sight of his own hands without it, and so he died, and I have ordered that no song mock him, because a man who cannot sleep for 6 years has been punished enough by the time the ancestors come, and the marsh children are owed grief, not gloating. The silver host thinned into the high air of the hall as the light does at dawn, 1 and 2 and then all of them, until only the smallest, the silver gray, remained a moment longer at my daughter's side. It touched its ghost nose once more to Ren's cheek, and once to Corin's, and then it turned its winter eyes to me, the last living Vale to sit the seat, the king who had let himself be dead for 6 years while his line went unguarded, and I braced for the judgment of it, for I deserved judgment. But there was no reproach in those ancient eyes. There was only a kind of vast and patient welcome, the look a father gives a son who has been a long time coming home. And the silver wolf lowered its great head to me once, the old salute of the host to a true king of the Iron Moon, the salute it had never once given Vorin Ashgard in 6 years of asking. And then it was gone into the light, and the wolf hall was full only of living wolves, hundreds of them, rising up off their knees around us with a sound like a rising tide. And the sound became a roar, and the roar became a name, my father's name and mine, going up from the great houses and the small folk together until the old stone rang with it. Vale, Vale, the true king, the king is come home. I did not go to the wolf's seat, I want that remembered too. With the whole pack roaring my name and the usurper dead at the foot of the dais and the crown lying loose in the moot speaker's shaking hands, I did not go up and take the black chair. I stood on the floor of the hall among my people with my mate and my children in my arms, and I let the roar wash over us, and I understood that I did not want the thing I had crossed 100 leagues to reclaim, not for its own sake, not for the weight of it that Vorin had said gets into a man like a wound. I had told Asen on the road that I would burn the seat to cinders and live in a hut if it would keep our children safe, and standing there I found it was still true. The seat was safe now. My children were safe now, and the only thing I truly wanted was already in my arms. But a king does not always get to choose the light thing, and there were 6 years of marsh work to answer for, and a reach gone rotten to heal, and a pack that had knelt to a false king with a splinter in its paw and needed, badly, to be shown that the old true thing could come again. So when the roar had run its course, I did go up. I carried Ren, and Asen carried Corin, and we went up the black rock of the dais together, the 4 of us, and I did not sit in the wolf's seat alone as 11 generations of my fathers had. I sat with my daughter in my lap and my mate at my side and my son held against her, and I looked out over the whole pack of the Iron Moon, the great and the small together, and I made them only one promise, which is the only promise I have ever kept perfectly. I promised them that no child of the Reach would ever again be made to hide the mark at its throat. The healing of the Reach is a longer tale than this one, and I will not lay all of it before you, for a saga must end somewhere, and this one ends with a family and not with a kingdom. But you should know that it was not a single golden morning after. 6 years of a false king do not wash out in a season. There were the bought lords to reckon with, some of whom had done far worse than merely bend the knee, and there was Bram Holt, who I could not in the end bring myself to kill, old traitor that he was, and whom I sent instead to keep the northern lighthouse alone for the rest of his days with the sea for company and his own conscience for a warden, which Asen said was crueler than a blade, and I dare say she is right. There were the marsh children to answer for. I had their names gathered, every one that could be found, every child Vorin had put in the ground in that first black year, and I had them carved into a long gray stone that stands now in the wolf hall where the crowning floor meets the dais, so that no king of the Iron Moon after me can walk up to that black chair without passing the price of it, and I go and stand before that stone on the first day of every year and read the names, all of them, aloud, because someone should, and it should be the king. Asen comes with me. She holds my hand while I read. She says it is the most important thing I do, more than any judgment or any war, and she is right about that too, as she is right about most things. But the part of the tale that is mine to tell, the part I have been circling all this while, is what happened between Asen and me. And I have saved it for the last because it is the truest treasure I carried out of that hole long dark. I did not assume her. That is the plainest way I can say it. When the crowning floor was cleared and the reach was mine again, I was king of the Iron Moon, and she was the true queen returned from the dead and the mother of my heirs. And by every custom and every law and every expectation of the whole pack, she was simply my wife again, restored to her place as if the 6 years were a door that had merely swung shut and now swung open. And I would not have it so. Because a man who comes back from the dead has no rights, only the chance to earn them, and because the woman I had found in a Fairomere fish market was not the girl I had married before the war. She was more than that girl. She was the widow Mar who had lain in the marsh reeds and gone off the wall of Greywater into the flood and stood in the dark with a fire iron ready to die swinging it. And that woman had built a whole life without me and owed me nothing, least of all herself. So on the first quiet evening we had, when the children were asleep at last in the nursery of Heikarn under a real roof with real guards who loved them, I took Asen up to the high rampart where the whole reach lay dark and rebuilding below us and the moon rode full over the pines. And I did not take her hand, and I said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that there is no wrong answer, and that whatever you say tonight, you and the children keep everything, the seat. The safety, the whole of it, that is yours by right and needs no gift of mine and no bargain. She waited, watching me the way she does, and I said, the moon made us mates before the war, and I have loved you every hour since, alive and dead. But you were made to live without me, and you did it. And you did it magnificently, and I will not have you back only because a bond you did not choose, and a war you did not want, and a law you did not write all say you must. So I am asking, not the king to his queen, not even the mate to his mate. Only Riston, who is a poorer and a stranger man than the one you married, asking Asen, who is a greater woman than the one I lost, whether she will have him freely or not at all. And if it is not at all, then I will be your children's father and your reach's king and your friend to the end of my days. And I will never once let you see that it cost me anything, because you have paid enough for both of us, and it is my turn to carry what is hard. She was quiet a long time on that rampart, and the moon moved, and I let her be quiet, because I had learned at last that love is mostly the willingness to wait for someone in the dark without hurrying them toward you. And then she said, you great fool of a king. But she said it the way she used to say it before the war in the warm hall, and my heart turned over. Do you think I lay in the marsh reeds for 6 years for a bond I did not choose? Do you think I carved 1,000 little wolves and cut the necks of their tunics high and lied to riders on my own doorstep because a law told me to? She turned to face me full in the moonlight, and the mark at her throat was silver with it, and so I felt was mine. I did it because they were yours. Because in every one of those 6 years, every day, you were the thing I could not have and would not stop loving, and I poured all of it into the two of them because they were the only piece of you left in the world. You were not a bond to me, Riston. You were not a law. You were the man I chose in the warm days and chose again in the marsh, and would have chosen 1,000 times over in any world the moon cared to make. I do not need you to ask me freely. And her voice caught, and she reached out at last and took my face in her 2 rough healer's hands the way she had that first morning in the garden. But I love you for asking. I love you more for asking than I would have loved you for assuming, because it means the man who came back is a better man than the king I lost, and I did not think that was possible, and it is the first thing in 6 years that has surprised me into being glad. And she drew my head down, and she kissed me under the full moon on the rampart of Heikarn, freely, wholly, her choice and mine together, and the bond between us that had been torn out and mourned and found again, and muffled in stone and torn open once more. The bond closed at last, all the way, and stayed closed, and has stayed closed every day since, and I have felt her warm and living at the far end of it through every hour of every year that has come after. And I will feel her there until the day the true host comes for me and I go, at last, into the silver light where all the fathers of the line are waiting. We were wed again in the spring, not because we needed it, we were mates and always had been, but because the reach needed to see it, needed a day of white blossom and ringing bells to lay over the gray years. And because Corin and Wren wanted a feast, and I have never in my life been able to refuse those two anything they truly wanted. It was a small wedding for a king's by choice. Elsk spoke the right. Halla came from Faramir and cried through the whole of it, and then ran the kitchens like a general. The shepherd who had hidden us in his fold stood in the front rank in a new cloak, and the ferryman who would take no coin was given, over his loud objections, a whole fine boat. The small folk of the Ironmoon filled the hall the way they had filled it on the day of the crowning, and this time they filled it for joy, and I looked out over them from beside my bride with my children at my feet, and I thought that this exactly was the thing Vorin had climbed his whole mountain and never once found at the top of it. The children took to Heirs faster than I did, which should not have surprised me, for they had none of my ghosts to carry into it. Corin declared the whole fortress his personal kingdom within a week and set about the conquest of it. The stables, the smithy, the top of every wall his mother would let him climb, and several she would not. And the old hard men of the guard, who had served a false king 6 gray years, went soft as spring butter over the pair of them. And I would find my son being taught to hold a practice spear by a scarred sergeant who had not smiled in living memory. And my daughter sitting in the moot speaker's own lap being shown how the great seal was pressed into the wax. It was Wren who worried me, though in that first year, because Wren remembers more than Corin does. She remembers the marsh a little. She remembers lying in the cold reeds with her mother's hand over her mouth, though she was scarcely more than a babe. She remembers being told, every day of her small life, never to let a stranger see the mark at her throat. And a child cannot simply be told that the danger is over and believe it in her bones the way she believed the fear. For months she wore her tunics buttoned high out of pure habit, and flinched when a stranger looked at her too long, and I would not shame her out of it, because I of all men know that the body keeps the old wounds long after the mind has been told they are healed. What mended her in the end was the naming stone. When I had the long gray stone carved with the names of the marsh children and set it in the wolf hall, Wren asked to see it. She is a grave child, and she had heard the guards speak of it. And Asen and I took her, the two of us, thinking to keep it brief and gentle. But Wren stood a long time before that stone, reading the names her mother had taught her letters well enough to read, all those small dead children who had borne a mark at the throat as she did. And at last she reached up and unbuttoned her own tunic to the collarbone, and she showed the crescentan star to the whole empty hall, to the carved names, plainly in the light the way she had never once been allowed to show it in her life. And she said not to us, to the stone, "I'm not hiding any more. Nobody has to hide any more. My father is the king now, and he made a promise." And then she buttoned her tunic back up, but loosely, the way a child wears a collar when she has simply forgot to be afraid of it. And from that day she was not afraid of it again, and I understood that I had carved that stone thinking it was for the dead, and found that it was, most of all, for one small living girl who needed to see her own grief given a place of honor before she could set it down. Asen, for her part, would not be only a queen. I offered her the whole quiet, cushioned life of a king's consort, and she looked at me as though I had offered to shoe her like a horse. Within a season, she had turned the eastern undercrofts of Heirs into a house of healing, the first the Reach had known since the war, and she trained the moon priestesses and the river wives in it, and the small folk who would once have died of a bad winter or a hard birthing came up the Cairn road to the queen's own hands instead, and she was more loved in a year than Vorin had bought himself in 6. There is a thing that happens to a country when its queen is a healer, and its king reads the names of the dead aloud on the first day of every year. The country begins, slowly, to believe that it is safe to heal, and a country that believes that will forgive its rulers a great deal, and rebuild faster than any army could make it. We did not rule the Ironmoon back to health by strength. We ruled it back by being, plainly and daily, and where the small folk could see it, the opposite of the 6 gray years. And it worked, and it is working still. And now, because a saga should end with a thing you can see, and not only a thing you can feel, let me tell you what I have built. Heirs is a fortress of gray warstone, cold and vast, made by fighting men for the holding of a hard country. And it is a fine seat for a king and a poor home for a family, and I have not tried to make it otherwise because a fortress should be a fortress. But there is a tower on the eastern wall, the smallest of the 4, that used to be a watch post and had stood empty since before my father's time. And in the first year of the peace I took it for my own, and I built something there with my own hands. And it is the truest thing I own, and no one comes there but the 4 of us and Elsk and Halla and the moon. The lowest room I made into a workshop. There is a wide bench under the eastern windows where the morning light comes in over the pines, and along the wall a rack of good knives and a bin of clean deadfall wood. and it smells of shavings and beeswax and the cedar oil we finish the carvings with, and it is where I have taught my son to carve as my father taught me and his father taught him. Corin has a true hand now, better than mine was at his age, and he cuts the flat plane along the flank because his knife runs that way, exactly as mine does. Exactly as my father's did, the line running down through the generations surer than any crown. And I have taught my daughter too, for Wren would not be left out of anything her brother did, and I would sooner cut off my hand than tell that girl there is a thing she may not do. She carves birds, mostly, small fierce wrens with their heads up and their wings half spread as if about to fly at something twice their size. And I keep the first one she ever finished in the pouch at my belt where I once carried nothing but grief. And I touch it sometimes in the moot when the lords are being foolish, and it steadies me. Above the workshop is the room I love best, and it is nothing, and it is everything. It is only a round stone chamber with a hearth and a deep window seat and a thick red rug that Halla made us, and it is where we go in the evenings when the day's kinging is done. There is a great chair by the fire that us Sen and I share, because we have never in 6 years of being apart been able to make ourselves sit in separate chairs again. And drawn up close to the hearth, side by side, there are 2 small carved stools that I made in the first month, one for Corin and one for Wren, each with a wolf's head cut into the top of the seat back, so that when my children are grown and gone these stools will still be here with the wolves keeping their small empty places by the fire, and I will sit in the great chair with my mate and look at those 2 empty stools and remember them small. But they are not empty yet. In the evenings they are full, and the 4 of us sit by the fire in the little round room at the top of the eastern tower, and Asen sows or grinds her healer's herbs, and I carve, and Corin tells enormous lies about his day, and Wren corrects every one of them, and the wind comes off the pines outside, and the marks at all 4 of our throats catch the firelight, and no one in that room is hiding anything from anyone, and that plain, warm, ordinary evening. That room full of my living family with the fire going, that is the thing I crossed the whole sea of my grief to find, and did not know I was looking for, and would not trade for 11 generations of the wolf's seat. There is one more thing in the tower, and then I am done. On the wall of the round room, over the hearth, I have set a long shelf, and on the shelf stand all the little carved wolves, every one we could gather. The ones Asen cut in the hard years in Faramir, the ones the children lost and the ones they kept, the badly made first one Corin and I cut together on the road with my hand around his, the fierce small wrens, the ones I have made since, a whole pack of them, 100 and more, gray and pale and dark, marching along the shelf over the fire in the light of the little round room. And in the middle of them all stands the very one I found in the mud of the Faramir market on the night the world gave me back my life, Corin's lost wolf, the one my own hands knew before my eyes did, worn smooth with a child's handling, the little carved thing that stopped me in the reeking dark and would not let me open my fingers. I put it in the center of the shelf where the firelight finds it first. Asen asked me once why that one and not a finer, and I told her the truth, which is that a man spends his whole life carving wolves against the dark, for the pups of his pack, for the mate the moon made him, for the children he fears he will never have, and sends them out into the world not knowing if any of them will ever find their way home. And one did. One little wolf, cut by a grieving hand in a river town at the edge of the world, traveled 6 years and 100 leagues through a war and a stolen kingdom, and lay itself down in the mud of a market square directly in the path of the one man in all the world who would know its maker's hand, and led him home. To her. To them. To this room and this fire and these 2 small stools and this shelf full of wolves. I was Alpha King over the whole gray reach of the Iron Moon, and I lost it all in a war, and I got it back with the ancestors of my line laid down at my children's feet in a hall full of kneeling wolves. And none of it, is the thing I would tell the moon I am grateful for if the moon should ask me at the end. I would tell it about the little round room at the top of the eastern tower. I would tell it about the 2 small stools by the fire and the shelf full of wolves, and the mark at my mate's throat catching the light while she grinds her herbs and pretends not to hear her children's lies. I would tell it that I rode 900 miles of burned country to forget one face, and found it again in a fish market, and that the finding cost me everything I had left and gave me back everything I had ever wanted, and that a wound can open and close in the same breath and go on healing for the rest of a man's life, and that this is what it did. The fire is burning low as I set this down. Asen has fallen asleep against my shoulder in the great chair. Corin and Wren are long abed, and their two small stools stand empty by the hearth, waiting for the morning to fill them again. The little carved wolf that led me home catches the last of the firelight from its place in the center of the shelf. And somewhere out over the dark pines the moon that made us all rides full and quiet over a reach at peace. Over a long gray stone in the wolf hall, carved with names I will read aloud on the first day of the year. Over a fortress that is a fortress and a tower that is a home. Over the whole hard-won ordinary world that I would not now give up for anything under the sky. I am Riston Vale, Alpha King of the Iron Moon, and I was dead, and I am not, and I am home. And if you are one who has lost the face you loved to the burned years, and told yourself the dead do not come back, and built a life out of not hoping, then hear an old king who did all of that and was wrong. Keep carving your wolves against the dark. Send them out. You cannot know which of them will find its way home to you, across what distance, through what ruin, in whose small, trusting hands. But the moon is patient, and the true blood is not lost so easily as we fear. And sometimes, on an ordinary Tuesday at the edge of the known world, the light falls a certain way across a face in a market. And the whole of your life begins again,